Good day, everybody. I am Vukosi Marivate. I am the Chair of Data Science at the University of Pretoria in South Africa and Director of the African Institute for Data Science and AI. I take myself as a community organizer for AI across the African continent, with most of my work being in natural language processing. I co-founded the Deep Learning Indaba, Masakane, which are movements that advocate for AI across the continent, and I'm also a co-founder of Lelapa AI, a socially conscious startup on AI. Now, just to set the scene, let's talk about machine learning. Machine learning is a subset of AI where we learn patterns from data. So a simple example, let's say we're given two dots, one on the left, one on the right, and what you're trying to do is say, in the future, when there's a dot, what color will it be? The simplest thing is to learn a simple straight line that's equidistant between two dots, and you just say, hey, whatever's on the left of that line in the future, I'll say it's red, what's on the right is blue. This is a simplification. Your data could be more complicated, so now you get more data, you then have to learn a more complicated decision boundary. Why has this become such a big thing? In the past, as a programmer, you'd have to write very specific instructions to the machine to then say, hey, if you get in data, this is what then you interpret it. But with machine learning, you provide as much data as possible, and the machine learns the patterns. In natural language processing, there's been a huge history of 70 years, right? Going into machine translation, speech systems, text-to-speech, and recently the large language models. But these really center English. Why is this a problem? If you look at GPT 3.5 in February 2023, you could ask it, please count from 1 to 10 in isiZulu, and it would actually respond and say, ku1, ku2, ku3, which is completely wrong. You say, translate from isiZulu to English, and kuyabiza ukugibela ibhanoyi, which in Zulu means it's expensive to go on an airplane. And that's how GPT responded. He insults him by calling him a cow, and many, many more problems. Why? A recent benchmark called UltraBench that was created by a team of researchers, African researchers, looks at different tasks like text classification, sentiment analysis, machine translation, and other natural language processing tasks and see how well do these LLMs actually do. And this is the finding. Here, what you look at is performance. What you want is somewhere close to 100. These are the different open models. Here's a few closed models that are there. And you will see that on average, the open models under 50, and then the big closed models, some of them get to 60. If then you fine-tune, so specifically fine-tune them for specific tasks in African languages, you see that now you get performances that are over 70. So if you actually train on African tasks in languages. So to train these models, you need a lot of pre-training data. If you're South African like me, one of the ways you can look at this is what is the representation of African languages in something like Wikipedia, because this data gets pre-trained. So English Wikipedia is almost 7 million articles. If you think about Africa, Egyptian Arabic is about 1.6 million. Swahili, spoken by millions and millions of people, only has 80,000 articles. There's Yoruba, 33,000, isiZulu, 10,000 or 11,000, Southern Sukse, 900. So there is not that data inside. But to train these really, really big models, you need more than Wikipedia. So Wikipedia is not enough. So what gets used is web crawling data. So web crawlers, what they do is they go around the internet. Initially, they were used for search engines, but then now there's services that also download or archive the internet for different uses, including research or journalistic research. More lately, this same data is used to actually train AI models. So I want to talk about Common Crawl. So Common Crawl is a big web crawl data that was created to archive the internet. It's a free, open repository of web crawl data. So it has about 250 billion pages, spanning about 17 years, and it's now been free and open since 2007. Now, the problem with Common Crawl is that what it does is that it provides this information, but it's mostly in English. What I mean by mostly, like more than 95% of its data is in English. So what happens with Common Crawl is that they take their crawls, they then try to identify if the content is in English, and if it's not, they tend to remove it. The reason that they remove it is that they do not have safety filters. So safety filters are, you might have child sexual abuse content that is sitting somewhere on the internet. And you then want to build a filter that then actually removes that content and you don't save it in your archive. The problem is, how do you identify that same content, but in the other thousands of languages of the world? You might not have that capability. So it might be safer just to say, I will only keep English and remove everything else because I can only safely filter whatever is in English. But this has consequence because the basic training data to train a large language model tends to be, for these very big models, to come from something like Common Crawl. And as such, it doesn't represent all of us, right? It only represents kind of a very specific view. And it's also a opinionated crawl, meaning it only goes and checks specific types of websites. Not everything is actually archived in those spaces. So what does this mean for us at this gathering, right? African languages representation matters. We have 2,000 languages on the African continent, but most are actually invisible to AR LLMs. Journalism also relies on access to timely, accurate, and relatable information. And as such, if you're excluding African languages, it means you exclude these audiences. To build towards equitable AI means also ensuring African citizens can consume and contribute to media in their mother tongues. So we want to preserve the dignity, allow people to participate, and then also have agency in this public sphere. There are risks, though. The benchmarks, as I showed you, show poor performance on global LLMs on African language tasks. This means there might be misinformation because when that model has to then respond to something, it's using the statistical information from the data that it has. So there's going to be mistranslation, loss of nuance, and also erasure of people. This training data is very scarce. There's poor ways to represent these languages, and as such, even the evaluation benchmarks, what I showed you, the upper bench, is very rare. There's dependencies then also on building these LLMs really being from the West, right? And as such, it might be that on those teams, there's not people who actually understand the challenge that other people actually face in using these systems. There are community-led approaches to try and resolve this. One is Masakani on the African continent and other grassroots natural language processing initiatives that work to build with communities. Local journalists, linguists, and technologists are shaping new data and evaluations as well. We also need to think about consent, ownership, and open science. We want to be open in that people can then study and better build for the languages, but at the same time, let's think about consent on how content is used by different organizations. As such, one way that people are doing is creating participatory benchmarks. They're doing center tasks that center African languages that you can find online. Other things, for example, that I've been part of is building a way for people to get access to terminology lists that have been created for many languages in an easy way. This gives you access to indigenous knowledge. It allows you to translate and then hopefully reach your audience in a much better way. Why is this useful? You can then see systems that can better respond when you actually give them requests about specific things. This gets us to build inclusive AI that empower us and yourselves in doing your work. So let's make sure journalism gets to a point where it speaks in all of Africa's languages, powered by locally built AI. Let's also invest in language inclusion as a democratic and developmental imperative, right? So meaning champion the writing in local language, asking the newsrooms to also go and make sure that some of their content is localized. We wanted to help with this. We built Marito, which is this data set for South African languages, where you get access to terminology lists. Once you have access to these terminology lists, one of the things that you can do, for example, is use with an LLM to now be able to help translate contextually. For example, one of the things we did was test if you can then take content about elections, ask the LLM to translate from English to Chivenda, one of our languages, and then use a terminology list to help it choose which actually words that are hard to find inside of the LLM to actually replace and put inside. And this showed like very good promise. Masakani, as I talked about earlier, works with a network of over 3,000 researchers who work on natural language processing, engage with each other, and really build the next generation of natural language processing tools. Not everything is about LLMs. It might be a good translation tool, a speech tool. All of these are worth studying and making better. At Lelapa, we work on building resource-efficient AI from Africa to the world. And we have multilingual speech systems that are available. We have a small language model called Nguba LM. And we've also thought about how do we license data better for communities to actually have sustainable ways that they can grow their resources that are used in AI. Nguba LM was the first African LLM that was built, and we're still trying to make it even smaller in these areas. So with this, I hope you've learned a bit from my talk, and that also you go out there and interact with all these communities and try to then find ways that you can use it in your work. Thank you for all our collaborators, as well as our funders as we do this work. Thank you, and please have a good meeting.